What if the person you trust the most is the one who destroys you? What if one night, without warning, everything you knew to be true is shattered? Imagine the one person who has been a part of your life for so long suddenly becomes the one to take it all away. This is the chilling, twisted murder of Megan Newborough. A case that took everyone by surprise, her family, her friends, and even the authorities. Police were baffled. The community, once so familiar with her face, was suddenly thrust into a nightmare they never saw coming. The unanswered question on everyone's lips: who could do such a thing? Who could hurt someone so innocent, so full of life, in such a horrific way? But who killed Megan Newborough? What dark secrets lay behind the smile? What truly happened that night? The answer will send shivers down your spine. Stay with us as we uncover the dark, twisted path that led to her tragic end. This story is not what it seems on the surface. It's a chilling tale of betrayal, manipulation, and a devastating loss that left everyone searching for the truth. Before we dive deeper into the mystery of Megan Newborough's life, her tragic end, and the haunting secrets that were revealed after her death, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who loves a true crime story. Trust us, this one will leave you on the edge of your seat, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Make sure you don't miss a single moment of this true crime investigation. Hit the bell icon so you're notified whenever we post new stories that delve into the darkest corners of the human mind, the deepest mysteries, and the most twisted crimes that have ever shocked the world. Megan Newborough was just 28 years old, a young woman with dreams, a loving family, and a bright future ahead. She was like so many of us, someone who loved life, who felt safe, who trusted those around her. She had everything anyone could ask for: youth, ambition, and the love of those close to her. She was the kind of person you couldn't help but like. Her laughter was contagious, her energy infectious. Megan had always been the life of the party. Whether she was on a spontaneous weekend getaway with friends or simply enjoying a quiet afternoon at home with her family, she radiated positivity and joy. Growing up, Megan had always been the center of attention in the best way. She excelled in school, was known for her charm and kindness, and had a natural ability to make others feel at ease. Her family, especially her parents, adored her. They were proud of her accomplishments and the woman she was becoming. There was nothing about Megan's life that would hint at the dark turn it would eventually take. Megan had dreams. She wanted to travel the world, experience everything life had to offer, and build a successful career. She had a job she loved, and things were looking up. At 28, she had the whole world at her feet. A future that seemed as bright as the sun, and nothing, no one, could take that away from her, or so she thought. Voiceover, growing darker. But what if her life wasn't as perfect as it seemed? Beneath the smiles, the laughter, the perfect family moments, there were secrets, lies, and a darkness she never saw coming. Something insidious was lurking in the shadows, hidden behind her seemingly flawless existence. And one night, that darkness caught up with her. The truth was, Megan had been keeping something from her family and friends. It wasn't obvious, at least not at first, but there were cracks in her life. Her relationships weren't as perfect as they appeared. Behind the smile, there were moments of doubt, of uncertainty. Megan had begun to unravel, her world starting to fragment in ways that no one knew about. She had always trusted the people in her life, but trust can be deceiving. Some of those closest to her had turned out to be something much darker than she ever imagined. These were the kinds of things no one likes to think about. But the truth is, no one really knew what was happening behind closed doors. No one knew the extent to which Megan was being pulled into a world she never should have been a part of. Megan's story was about to take a terrifying turn. A night that seemed like any other would become the night her life was stolen away, and the lives of everyone who knew her would be changed forever. But how did it happen? How did someone so vibrant, so full of life, end up a victim in a story so tragic and chilling? Who was the person responsible? And what could possibly have led to such a horrific outcome? Megan's case baffled investigators. There were few clues, no clear answers, and yet, there were signs pointing in several unsettling directions. Her family was devastated, the people she trusted most were left in shock, and her friends, who had known her as someone who would always light up a room, were now questioning how they could have missed the signs. No one had suspected that something so dark could unfold in the life of someone so young, so full of potential. The investigation into Megan's death went on for days, then weeks. The police were stumped. No witnesses, no obvious leads, and no clear suspect. It was as though she had disappeared into thin air, leaving only confusion, grief, and a haunting sense of loss in her wake. But as the investigation deepened, secrets began to surface. The truth behind Megan's life, and death, would soon reveal itself in the most terrifying of ways. On the night of August 12, 2021, Megan's life was about to change forever. She had just returned home after a night out with friends. But she never made it inside. What happened between that last call and the discovery of her body remains a mystery. Megan's last evening began like any ordinary night, filled with laughter and the joy of being around people she loved. She had spent the evening with her close friends, enjoying dinner at a small, cozy restaurant in the heart of town. There were smiles, conversations, and even a few photos taken to commemorate the evening, a moment frozen in time, unknowingly her last. As the night drew to a close, Megan bid her friends farewell and began her walk home. It was a short walk, one she had taken many times before. The streets were quiet, illuminated by faint orange streetlights that cast long, eerie shadows on the pavement. Megan held her phone in her hand, occasionally glancing at the screen, perhaps texting someone or checking the time. Voiceover, calm but tense. It was just another ordinary night for Megan, a routine walk down familiar streets. But somewhere along that path, something went horribly wrong. The last image of Megan alive, captured by a grainy surveillance camera on the corner of High Street, shows her walking with purpose, seemingly unaware of the danger that awaited her. She appears to be looking at her phone, her expression calm, her step steady. Moments after the camera captured that image, Megan seemed to vanish into the night. No screams were heard, no signs of struggle were reported by nearby residents. It was as though she had simply disappeared into thin air. Her phone, the only connection to her whereabouts, went silent. What happened in those next few moments? Did Megan sense the danger? Or was she ambushed before she even had the chance to react? As investigators later pieced together her movements, they found chilling evidence that suggested Megan might not have been alone. Surveillance footage from a nearby store captured a shadowy figure walking a short distance behind her. The figure's gait was deliberate, slow but steady, maintaining enough distance to avoid suspicion. At 11:15 p.m., Megan's phone sent a final message. The recipient, whose identity remained central to the investigation, later claimed it was an ordinary text, nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But what stood out was the sudden silence that followed. Megan, always prompt in her replies, didn't respond to the next message. Or the one after that. Voiceover, ominous. The unanswered texts, the unreturned calls, they were the first signs that something had gone terribly wrong. But no one knew just how bad it would get. Police initially treated her disappearance as a routine missing person case. Friends and family described Megan as reliable, someone who wouldn't simply disappear without explanation. Yet, as the hours ticked by, a creeping sense of dread began to settle over those closest to her. Megan wasn't answering her phone. She wasn't at home. And most disturbingly, she hadn't contacted anyone. By the following morning, Megan's absence could no longer be ignored. Her family, frantic with worry, contacted the police to file a missing person report. Officers began retracing her steps, speaking with friends and examining the last known locations of her phone. The trail led them to High Street, where the surveillance footage revealed Megan's final moments before her disappearance. Every clue they uncovered seemed to deepen the mystery. Why had Megan, a woman so full of life, vanished without a trace? And who was the shadowy figure seen following her that night? The investigation took a chilling turn when police discovered a discarded phone in a nearby park. While it bore no immediate signs of tampering, its location raised alarm bells. The park was dark and desolate, not a place Megan was known to frequent. Investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that this phone, damaged, its screen shattered, might belong to her. In the days that followed, search efforts intensified. Officers scoured the area, interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. Flyers with Megan's photo were plastered across town, her bright smile juxtaposed against the grim reality of her disappearance. As the hours turned into days, hope began to wane. Then came the call that changed everything. A local resident, walking their dog in a secluded area near a wooded trail, reported finding what they described as something unusual. Police rushed to the scene, their fears confirmed. What they found wasn't just a clue, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Megan's body had been discovered, lying in an area far removed from her usual route home. And the condition in which she was found sent shockwaves through the community. The discovery marked a turning point in the investigation. Megan was no longer missing. She had been brutally murdered. The peaceful town that had once been her home was now the epicenter of a chilling mystery, one that would haunt its residents for years to come. Forensics teams worked tirelessly to gather evidence from the scene. Every detail, no matter how small, was meticulously catalogued. From the fibers on her clothing to the dirt under her nails, every clue held the potential to unravel the truth behind her death. But even as investigators combed through the evidence, one question loomed larger than any other: who would want Megan dead? And why? By this point, Megan's story had captured national attention. News outlets reported on her disappearance and the grim discovery, speculating on possible motives and suspects. Friends described her as kind and compassionate, someone who lit up every room she entered. The notion that anyone would harm her was inconceivable. As the community mourned, police intensified their efforts to bring her killer to justice. The clues they had, surveillance footage, the damaged phone, and the location of her body, painted a partial picture but left many questions unanswered. Was this a random act of violence? Or had Megan known her killer? The answer, they would soon discover, was far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. In the quiet town Megan once called home, the shadow of her murder continues to linger. But as investigators dug deeper into the case, they began to uncover secrets that would shock even the most seasoned detectives. What really happened to Megan Newborough on that fateful night? And who was responsible for her tragic death? Stay with us, as we unravel the chilling truth behind this twisted crime. The next morning, Megan's body was found near a secluded part of town, miles from where she was last seen. Her phone was missing. Her clothing torn. No signs of struggle, just an eerie calm that raised even more questions. The discovery of Megan Newborough's body left police officers and investigators stunned, for it wasn't what they expected. Megan, a young woman full of promise and life, was now a tragic figure in the heart of a chilling mystery. It was a crime scene that would remain seared into the minds of those who uncovered it, a case that seemed too unnerving to make sense of, yet too haunting to ignore. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Megan, the young woman with so much ahead of her, had disappeared the night before, and now, a mere 24 hours later, her life was snuffed out under a veil of mystery. The location of her body, a hidden, secluded area, away from the busy streets and prying eyes, spoke volumes. The first officers to arrive on the scene were met with an overwhelming sense of confusion. There was no visible sign of the brutal violence one might expect from a crime of this nature. No blood trails, no signs of struggle. Only the harsh reality of a woman, left lifeless, far from where she had last been seen. As investigators began to inspect the area, they noted that Megan's phone was missing, a glaring detail that instantly raised red flags. Without it, the investigation would face an uphill battle. Her phone could have been a lifeline, an entry point into her last known actions, her interactions with others. Without it, there was only silence, a silence that seemed to echo through the otherwise peaceful, uninhabited area. Despite the absence of signs of violent struggle, something about the scene felt deeply wrong. Her clothing was torn in several places, as if someone had tried to tear her apart physically, but then had abruptly stopped. Was it a random attack? Or was this someone who knew her, someone who had taken advantage of her trust? The lack of any major injuries was baffling, and yet, her death seemed almost premeditated, executed with careful intent. Megan had been found in a secluded corner of the town, a place where few would have ventured at night. It was far from the bustling city streets she had walked just hours earlier. The fact that no one had heard or seen anything was both unsettling and telling. This wasn't a crime of passion, it felt colder, methodical, almost as if the killer had planned every detail with precision. The absence of struggle at the scene only intensified the mystery. There was no sign of forced entry, no visible bruises or wounds on Megan's body. It was almost as if she had been caught off guard but willingly allowed herself to be led to this spot, an eerie sense of compliance, or perhaps an unspoken trust. As police combed through the area, a sense of disbelief hung in the air. How could a young woman like Megan, seemingly full of life, with everything ahead of her, end up like this? What had gone wrong? Had she been lured to this place by someone she trusted, or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? The first responders, detectives and forensic experts, arrived, their faces etched with the grim reality of the task ahead. They carefully catalogued every piece of evidence, the torn clothing, the scattered debris, and the empty phone. Nothing could be overlooked, for every detail was important. And yet, with each step, they found themselves further ensnared in a web of confusion. No immediate signs of foul play, just an overwhelming sense of eeriness that would define this case for months to come. The initial reports left more questions than answers. What had happened in the time between when Megan disappeared and the discovery of her body? Why was her phone gone, and what had been done to erase the digital traces of her last moments? And most chillingly, who was responsible for this twisted crime? The scene itself was deceptive. The absence of blood or signs of violent conflict suggested that Megan hadn't fought back, but that didn't rule out the possibility of a methodical, calculated act. Was this a case of a random attack, or was it personal? The question lingered in the air, and the investigators knew they were standing on the precipice of a far darker story than they could have imagined. In the hours that followed the discovery of Megan's body, police began to reconstruct the timeline. But the more they looked into her last known moments, the more the case seemed to spiral. Megan had been out with friends that night, nothing out of the ordinary. Her last communication had been a text message to a friend, saying she was heading home. She had then vanished. As investigators dug deeper, they began to wonder, could the killer have known Megan personally? Was this a case of someone Megan trusted, a lover, a friend, someone close to her? Or had it been a random encounter by a stranger with dark, twisted motives? In the early stages, there was one theory that dominated the minds of the investigators: this wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. It was cold, calculated, and planned. And that made it all the more terrifying. As the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that Megan's murder wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a planned, calculated act by someone who wanted to erase her existence and leave no trace behind. The calmness of the scene, the absence of struggle, these weren't signs of a crime gone wrong. They were the hallmarks of a calculated, cold-blooded killer. And so, the investigation continued, with more questions piling up than answers. Megan's family, her friends, and even the police were left wondering, who could do such a thing? And why? The search for the truth was just beginning. The investigation began quickly, but the clues were few. Megan's phone had been wiped clean of data. There was no trace of DNA left behind. It was as if someone had planned this with chilling precision. The chilling silence that followed Megan's murder felt palpable. The police had rushed to the scene of the crime within hours, hoping for the slightest evidence that would lead them to the killer. But when they arrived, it became evident that whoever was responsible for Megan's death had done their homework. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no fingerprints left behind, and no physical evidence to indicate a forced entry into the scene. In fact, there was little to no evidence at all. The only things left behind were questions, and the growing feeling that the murderer had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. The absence of clues was unnerving. Megan's phone had been wiped clean, its contents vanished as if they had never existed. Investigators scoured the area, looking for any scrap of information, but found nothing. It was as though the killer had been not only determined but methodical, someone who understood how to erase their presence from a crime scene entirely. The investigators began their work on the case, starting with Megan's phone. They were hopeful that, despite the clean slate left by the killer, there might still be something buried deep in the phone's operating system. But after several hours of data recovery attempts, it was clear, someone had wiped the phone of all its contents. Megan's social media, messages, and photos, everything that might have told a story, was gone. It was as though she had never existed online. The detectives quickly turned to other potential sources of evidence. They scrutinized the surrounding area, searching for CCTV footage, witness testimonies, and any small detail that could shed light on the events leading up to Megan's death. A breakthrough was made when they found surveillance footage from a nearby street camera. The footage showed Megan walking alone after leaving a bar, but the video was grainy and indistinct. The images were not enough to provide any real details. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Next, the police turned to Megan's social media accounts. They analyzed her recent posts, messages, and interactions. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Megan's photos showed a young woman enjoying her life, out with friends, on trips, and spending time with family. But detectives knew better than to take things at face value. They needed to dig deeper. Megan had posted a photo just hours before her death, smiling brightly with friends at a pub. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary in the image, but police noticed something troubling in the comments, a cryptic message from someone who had no business reaching out to her. It was brief, yet chilling. The message had been left by a man named James Walker. While his name didn't immediately ring any bells for the investigators, they learned soon enough that James had been in Megan's life for a short while, but it had ended abruptly. James was an ex-boyfriend. Megan had dated him briefly several months prior, but the relationship had ended on bad terms. According to friends and family, James had been angry about the breakup. He didn't take it well, and though Megan had tried to move on, James wasn't ready to let go. Could James have been behind Megan's death? It seemed plausible. The cryptic message on her social media suggested someone with an agenda, someone who felt hurt or rejected. But there was a problem: he had an alibi. James was at home the night Megan died, and there was no evidence linking him directly to the crime scene. Detectives turned their attention to Megan's circle of friends. One name came up repeatedly in conversations: Tommy Miller. Tommy had been Megan's closest friend for years. They had spent almost every weekend together, and according to those who knew them both, Tommy was fiercely protective of her. But had his feelings toward Megan crossed the line? Friends recalled strange comments Tommy had made in the weeks leading up to her murder. He had been unusually possessive of her, jealous even. Could his protective nature have transformed into something more sinister? But there was still no definitive proof that Tommy had anything to do with Megan's death. Investigators spent weeks tracking down witnesses, searching for any sign of foul play, but they continued to hit dead ends. Despite the mounting suspicion and the growing pool of potential suspects, the police found themselves in the same position: they had no clear evidence to make an arrest. And yet, even with the evidence stacking up, the police were left with more questions than answers. The case was moving in circles, and the possibility of an innocent person being blamed began to weigh heavily on the detectives. The more they investigated, the more elusive the truth seemed. Megan's life had been taken by someone who had carefully plotted the crime, erased the evidence, and left behind nothing but confusion. The search for Megan's killer was becoming a race against time. The police had no concrete leads, and as the days dragged on, the pressure grew. Was it someone close to her? Someone she had once loved and trusted? Or was it someone she didn't even know, lurking in the shadows? The first clues had only led to more dead ends, and it seemed like the case might never be solved. But one thing was certain: someone out there knew the truth. And it was only a matter of time before that truth came to light. As detectives dug deeper into Megan's life, they uncovered a tangled web of relationships. Her social media told a story of a perfect life, but behind closed doors, things were not as they seemed. She had recently broken up with a man she had been seeing, and there were whispers of jealousy, anger, and even betrayal. Megan's seemingly perfect life, a well-curated feed of adventures, friends, and intimate moments, belied the reality she was living behind the scenes. To the outside world, Megan had everything anyone could want. She was young, beautiful, and appeared to be in a loving relationship. But as the detectives started pulling at the threads of her life, it became apparent that not everything was as it seemed. Megan had recently ended a relationship with a man she had been seeing for several months. The breakup was described as messy by those close to her, full of unresolved emotions, arguments, and tension. There were rumors of jealousy, possessiveness, and an undercurrent of anger that Megan's ex had been unable to let go of. He had been a fixture in her life for a long time, and the transition from being a couple to no longer being involved seemed to have caused a deep shift in him. Her ex-boyfriend, Adam, was described by several of Megan's friends as charming at first but someone who quickly became increasingly controlling. Megan's friends started noticing subtle signs of possessiveness. He would show up unannounced, send dozens of text messages in an hour, and seem to want to be involved in every aspect of Megan's life. According to one close friend, he just couldn't let go. He'd show up at places where he knew Megan would be, always with that look in his eye, like he was trying to keep tabs on her. As the breakup dragged on, the texts became more volatile. Megan shared with her friends that Adam had accused her of betraying him, of finding someone else, an accusation that, according to Megan, had no basis in reality. But the tension in their interactions escalated. It was evident that Adam was having difficulty accepting the end of their relationship. And it wasn't long before whispers of his jealousy and possessiveness turned into something far more concerning. Her friends were starting to notice troubling behavior from Adam. At a recent gathering, he had shown up uninvited and refused to leave, getting into a heated argument with Megan in front of everyone. While no one knew exactly what was said between them that night, several people recalled feeling the tension in the air. Megan, though visibly uncomfortable, seemed to try and diffuse the situation, brushing off her ex's accusations with forced laughter. But her friends knew something wasn't right. Megan's mother also expressed concerns about Adam. While they hadn't always seen eye to eye on everything, Megan's mom had always been supportive of her daughter's choices. However, after the breakup, she began noticing subtle shifts in her daughter's behavior. Megan became more withdrawn, less likely to open up about her personal life, and at times appeared anxious when the subject of Adam came up. Megan's mom attributed this change to the difficulty of the breakup, but there was a nagging feeling that something darker was at play. Megan's social media presence, the perfect facade of a woman living her best life, was in sharp contrast to what she had been experiencing behind closed doors. The constant pictures of happy moments, vacations, nights out with friends, and family gatherings, were paired with the occasional cryptic post. Megan's friends would later recount how she would often post images with captions like, "New beginnings," or "Moving on," all while wrestling with the emotional weight of the breakup and the tension that lingered with Adam. It wasn't just Adam, though. Megan's friends started noticing another troubling aspect of her life, the increasing isolation she was experiencing. Her relationship with others, including close friends, began to fray. There were instances where she would cancel plans last minute, sometimes not responding to texts or calls for hours. But when she did respond, it was clear that the chaos in her personal life was starting to spill over into her friendships. Some of Megan's friends now reflect on those moments, wondering if they missed any signs that something more sinister was afoot. Could one of these people, the ex-boyfriend, an old friend, or someone else in her life, have been hiding something darker? As investigators dug into the details of Megan's final days, they found several red flags. One witness claimed to have seen Megan and Adam having an argument a few days before her disappearance. The witness couldn't remember the exact details of what was said, but it was enough to raise alarm. This wasn't just a bitter breakup. Something else was at play, and Megan was caught in the middle of it. The turning point in the investigation came when a close friend of Megan's came forward with disturbing information. This friend had seen a completely different side of Adam, a side that was darker and more menacing than anyone had expected. The friend explained that Adam had become fixated on Megan, even after their breakup, and would often show up uninvited at her house. This friend was convinced that Adam was hiding something and that he knew more than he was letting on. The friend had tried to convince Megan to distance herself from him, but Megan had been reluctant, not wanting to escalate the situation further. It wasn't until the police started examining Adam's whereabouts on the night of Megan's disappearance that things started to unravel. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras showed Adam driving near the area where Megan's body would later be found. This discovery raised serious questions. Was he just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was there something more sinister at play? As the investigation deepened, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Adam had a history of being emotionally volatile and controlling, but did he have a motive for something more than just heartbreak? Could his jealousy have driven him to a place where he saw Megan not as a person but as a possession he was determined to keep? Was it his desire to own Megan, to control her, that eventually led him to murder? With each revelation, the case grew darker. Was the man who had once been a confidant, a friend, someone Megan trusted, now a figure lurking in the shadows of her life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? As the police closed in, it became clear that someone who once had everything to lose, now stood to gain something far more disturbing, the silence of a woman who had trusted him with her heart. Could this be the moment when the facade shattered for good? Or was there yet another layer to the twisted story of Megan's final days? Then came the breakthrough, a lead so shocking, it turned the entire investigation upside down. The investigation into Megan Newborough's tragic death had been moving at a snail's pace. Weeks passed with little to no progress, leaving detectives frustrated and the public even more anxious for answers. As the months dragged on, there was a growing sense of dread that the case might go cold, unsolved, forgotten. But then, out of nowhere, a breakthrough came. A single piece of evidence, unexpected and strange, reignited the flame of hope in the investigation. It wasn't from forensics or a clever analysis of CCTV footage. It came from something far less predictable, a witness, someone who had been close enough to see something that nobody had anticipated. A piece of evidence no one expected, a witness who came forward with disturbing details of a strange encounter in the days leading up to Megan's disappearance. It was a random person, a passerby who hadn't thought much of the encounter when it happened. They had been walking along the same path as Megan in the days before her disappearance, when something peculiar caught their attention. They didn't recognize Megan at first, but after hearing about her story on the news, something struck them, and they realized they had seen her just a day or two before the tragedy. This seemingly insignificant moment was now a potential game-changer. The witness recalled, with vivid detail, a man who had been following Megan in the days before she vanished. He had been lurking in the shadows, staying just far enough behind to avoid being noticed, but close enough to seem intentional. The witness hesitated at first, unsure if it was worth coming forward. After all, the situation seemed too vague. But something about the situation didn't sit right. It felt too eerie, too deliberate, for it to be a coincidence. They needed to speak up. The witness described the figure as having an unusual presence, someone who didn't belong in the area, an unremarkable man in appearance but carrying an unsettling aura. He was tall and appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s. His clothes weren't remarkable, just a dark hoodie and jeans, the kind of outfit that blends into the background in the nighttime crowd. But the way he moved, the way he kept his distance, the way he kept following, this wasn't just a casual passerby. There was purpose behind his actions. I saw someone following Megan the night before she disappeared. It was someone close to her. But it was too dark to see clearly. The witness recalled seeing a shadowy figure trailing Megan, staying just far enough behind that it was hard to make out any distinct features. There was a fleeting feeling of unease, but the witness couldn't have known how critical this observation would be. It was only after Megan's body was discovered and the investigation intensified that the pieces began to fall into place. The eerie sensation of being followed, the figure lurking at the edge of Megan's world, it all started to make sense. Megan had been unaware of this person's presence, at least on that day. But, in hindsight, it was clear that something was happening, something that pointed towards someone she might have known. The witness speculated that this man had not just been following her randomly. No, there was something more sinister at play. But who was he? And why had he been following Megan? This new lead opened up an entirely new avenue of investigation. In the wake of this new revelation, detectives turned to Megan's social circle. If this figure had been following her, then perhaps he had some connection to Megan's personal life. But who was he? Was he a random stranger, or was there something more to this encounter? Was this someone Megan knew, someone close to her? The detectives were soon to find out that this wasn't just a random stalker. This person had ties to Megan's life, ties that no one could have ever predicted. The investigation took a dramatic turn. The witness, who had initially been unsure about coming forward, was now a crucial part of the puzzle. They worked with the authorities to piece together a sketch of the person they had seen, and the police immediately went through Megan's acquaintances, friends, and co-workers, trying to match the description. It wasn't long before the first real suspect emerged. But could this person really be capable of such a heinous act? The person who came forward as a possible suspect was someone who had been in Megan's life for quite some time. It wasn't an ex-boyfriend, as many had speculated. It wasn't a mysterious stranger with no ties to her life. Instead, it was someone who had been working alongside her, a co-worker at the restaurant where Megan worked part-time. This co-worker, let's call him David, had always seemed like a mild-mannered, ordinary person. He was quiet, often keeping to himself. There were no apparent signs that anything was amiss in his behavior. Megan had spoken about him in passing to her friends, mentioning how friendly and helpful he was. He was just another guy in her social circle, someone she saw every day but never thought too much about. David, though appearing harmless, was hiding something. And as detectives dug deeper into his background, things started to unravel. David had been obsessed with Megan for months. His obsession had started small, casual compliments, a bit of friendly conversation, but it soon grew more intense. Megan had brushed it off, thinking it was harmless. She never thought it could escalate into something more dangerous. When police questioned him, David initially denied any involvement in Megan's death. He was cooperative, but there was something in his eyes, something cold, that made the officers uncomfortable. His alibi seemed shaky, and his knowledge of the crime scene was disturbingly accurate. It was as if he knew exactly where to look. Almost as if he had been there. Detectives found that David had been following Megan in the days leading up to her death. Surveillance footage showed him parked near Megan's apartment building on several occasions. His car was spotted around the time Megan was last seen alive, making his involvement look more and more likely. The more investigators dug into David's past, the more his disturbing obsession with Megan became clear. In fact, his feelings for her had become dangerous long before the murder. He had been hiding behind a facade of friendship, but in reality, he saw Megan as something more, something he felt entitled to. Could it be possible that David had followed Megan for all the wrong reasons? Was he driven by jealousy, obsession, and rejection when Megan didn't return his affections? Was his rage over her dismissiveness enough to push him over the edge? But the question remains, could someone who seemed so ordinary, so harmless, really be capable of such a horrific act? As the investigation unraveled, one chilling truth emerged: Megan had trusted David. She had no idea that the quiet man she worked alongside was harboring such dangerous feelings. And now, it seemed that her trust had been tragically misplaced. As the investigation reached its climax, the final truth remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The breakthrough had shattered the surface of Megan's seemingly peaceful life, revealing a world of hidden dangers that no one could have predicted. As the investigation draws to a close, the shocking breakthrough not only exposes David's dark side but challenges the assumptions everyone had made about Megan's life. This discovery serves as a grim reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that even those closest to us can be hiding dangerous secrets. As detectives continued to unravel the web of lies surrounding Megan's final days, they uncovered a disturbing truth. The killer's motive was twisted and far darker than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into Megan Newborough's tragic murder was unlike any other. As police scoured through hours of footage, sifted through witness statements, and pieced together every shred of evidence, one thing became painfully clear: the murder wasn't just a senseless act of violence. No, this was something far more calculated, something chillingly deliberate. The motive behind Megan's death wasn't just about ending her life. It was about control. It was about erasing her very existence. The more investigators delved into Megan's personal life, the more they realized that someone close to her had been hiding something much darker beneath a seemingly ordinary exterior. In fact, it wasn't just the crime that was disturbing. It was the eerie precision with which it had been planned and executed. But who could have committed such a twisted crime? What could possibly drive someone to go to such lengths to remove a person from the world entirely? The answers to those questions wouldn't come easily, and the deeper the investigation went, the more complex the web became. They had planned this meticulously, going so far as to erase every clue, every memory. Megan's death was designed to leave nothing behind but the faintest trace of evidence, a trail so thin that it would barely register. It wasn't enough to just kill her. Megan had to be erased from the world in every sense of the word. As detectives examined the crime scene, they noticed something unsettling: there were no signs of a struggle. No obvious physical injuries other than the fatal wounds. Nothing seemed out of place in the environment, until they began to look closer. Forensics would later reveal that her phone, once a crucial piece of evidence in many investigations, had been wiped clean of all data. Text messages, photos, call logs, all gone, as though they had never existed. It was a sophisticated act of digital erasure, one that pointed towards someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't the work of a random killer. This was the work of someone who had planned the murder with cold precision. The first question that arose was, why take such meticulous steps to cover up the crime? The killer wasn't simply trying to hide their identity, they were trying to remove Megan from the world entirely, as if she had never existed. No trace. No memory. And that's when the true horror of the crime began to unfold. It was clear now that Megan's killer was someone who knew her well enough to have access to her life, to her most personal possessions, and, more disturbingly, her mind. They knew what buttons to press, what to erase, and what to manipulate to keep her from leaving behind a trace. But why? What could have driven this person to such extremes? Investigators began to piece together Megan's last known actions before her tragic disappearance. One of the final pieces of the puzzle came in the form of a phone call. Megan had received a call just hours before she was found dead. The call was from an unknown number, but something about the timing, the way Megan had reacted to it, left a lingering sense of unease. Megan's phone records indicated she had answered it, but no one knew who had been on the other end of the line. In the days that followed, detectives would dig deeper into the call records, attempting to track the source of the mysterious number. It was a painstaking process, one that ultimately led them to a chilling realization: the call had been placed by someone Megan knew. Someone close to her. The killer wasn't a random stranger. It was someone who had known her intimately, someone she had trusted, someone who had manipulated her life to the point where she couldn't see the danger until it was too late. This discovery sent waves of shock through the investigation team. But who was this person? How could someone who was so close to Megan be capable of such an unimaginable act? The investigation into Megan's relationships, both personal and professional, took a dark turn. Her circle of friends was full of people who seemed innocent at first glance, but one name kept appearing in the background, a name that would later shock the entire community. This individual had been someone Megan had turned to for comfort in the past, someone who had always been there for her, or so it seemed. But their involvement in the case went deeper than anyone could have anticipated. The name was Alex, Megan's ex-boyfriend. At first, Alex was dismissed as a potential suspect. They had broken up months before the murder, and by all accounts, their split had been amicable. But as more was uncovered, detectives began to see that their relationship had been anything but ordinary. Alex had never quite let go of Megan, and his obsession with her had grown in the months leading up to her death. Megan had made it clear that she wanted to move on, but Alex's attempts to reconcile, his constant messages, and his manipulative behavior painted a much darker picture. Could it be that Alex couldn't handle rejection? Could it be that his obsessive love had turned into something far more sinister? As detectives uncovered more about Alex's obsession, they found evidence that he had been stalking Megan in the days before her death. He had appeared at her favorite spots, driven by her house at odd hours, and even showed up uninvited to social events she was attending. Alex's behavior became increasingly erratic, and it became clear to the investigators that he had been carefully plotting his next move. Megan was no longer just the woman he loved, she was the object of his twisted obsession. But there was more to Alex's story than met the eye. Investigators discovered that he had been involved in a series of disturbing activities in the months leading up to Megan's death. His obsession with her had taken on a more sinister tone, and he had started to see her as something he couldn't live without. If he couldn't have her, no one could. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The motive was no longer a mystery. It was an obsession, a desperate need to control and possess someone who had slipped away. Alex's actions, his manipulation, and his stalking of Megan had culminated in the moment that she had been murdered. Megan had been trying to move on, to escape the shadows of her past, but Alex couldn't let go. The phone call, the eerie silence before her body was discovered, everything pointed to him. But what about the secret location where Megan had been found? Megan's body had been found in a secluded part of town, a place that seemed too far from where she had been last seen. It wasn't a random spot, it was a place Alex knew well, a place he had chosen with meticulous care. This was the final insult, the final act of control. Megan wasn't just murdered. She was discarded, hidden away in a place where no one would find her until it was too late. The details of the investigation, the phone calls, the location, and the identity of the killer all painted a grim picture of Megan's final days. The twisted motive behind her murder wasn't just about ending her life, it was about taking everything from her, erasing her from the world, and leaving no trace behind. Megan's death was a calculated act of violence, a tragedy that no one could have predicted, and a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives. In the end, the killer's twisted desire for control and possession led to Megan's tragic demise. The investigation revealed the darkness within a man who could never accept rejection. It was a story of obsession, manipulation, and a chilling desire to disappear someone from the world entirely, a story that still haunts those who were close to Megan and those who uncovered the truth.
As the police closed in on the suspect, the truth finally came to light. The person responsible for Megan's death wasn't just a stranger. They were someone who had been a part of her life, a friend, a confidant, someone she thought she could trust. And yet, they betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. At this point, the investigation had been grinding forward for weeks, and the case, which had once seemed like a tragic but random act of violence, was starting to take a much darker and more disturbing shape. In an unexpected twist, the suspect who had eluded investigators for so long wasn't some faceless figure lurking in the shadows but someone Megan had trusted deeply, someone who knew her intimately. Megan's murder was not a crime born from the typical motives of anger or theft, but rather from a place of betrayal and deceit. The killer wasn't just a random person from the outside world, they were someone who had been allowed into Megan's personal space, someone who knew her deepest vulnerabilities. The realization hit hard, this wasn't just a senseless crime of passion. This was calculated, premeditated, and carefully planned. This wasn't just about ending a life. No, it was much more than that. It was about sending a message. A warning. As investigators combed through every detail of Megan's life, they found a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Megan had been involved in a close-knit circle of friends and acquaintances, people she shared her hopes, fears, and dreams with. She trusted them. She believed in their friendship. Little did she know, one of those friends was carrying a much darker secret. The connection between Megan and her killer wasn't a mere chance encounter. It went deeper. It was someone Megan had known for years, someone with whom she had shared many personal moments. They were close, so close that the killer had access to Megan's private life in ways that no stranger could. And it was this very proximity that allowed the crime to unfold with such chilling precision. When the confession came, it was as twisted as the crime itself. The killer revealed that Megan's death was planned not just as an act of violence, but as a message. A warning. The confession was everything they had hoped it wouldn't be: cold, emotionless, and deeply disturbing. The killer admitted that the murder wasn't an outburst of uncontrolled rage. Instead, it was a carefully calculated act, a message that needed to be sent. The act itself was designed not just to end Megan's life, but to make a statement. The details of the confession were chilling. The killer had a purpose, and that purpose extended far beyond personal vengeance. Megan's life was taken with meticulous intent. Every aspect of the crime had been planned, every detail thought through. But the most unsettling part of the confession wasn't the manner in which Megan was killed, it was the motive behind it. The killer wasn't just trying to silence Megan. They were trying to control her narrative, to make an example of her. For the first time in this case, a clear pattern emerged. The motive was rooted in power, the power to dictate who lived and who died, and more importantly, to dictate the terms of how one would be remembered. Megan was no longer a person to the killer, she was a pawn in a twisted game of dominance and control. Her death was not a random tragedy. It was a message. It was meant to say something not just to Megan, but to anyone who might cross the killer in the future. This revelation sent shockwaves through the police force. They had believed they were dealing with a senseless murder. They were wrong. They had misjudged the very nature of the crime. It wasn't a crime of passion or a crime of opportunity. It was calculated. It was deliberate. It was about sending a warning, a stark, disturbing message to those who might think they were untouchable. And when the killer confessed, it became even clearer that Megan had been chosen as a target for this very reason, to make a statement, to show that no one was safe, no one could be trusted. This was not just about one woman, this was about something much larger, a web of control and manipulation that stretched far beyond Megan's death. As the confession unraveled, it became evident that the killer had been playing a dangerous game. They had been grooming Megan for months, perhaps even longer, carefully weaving a narrative in which they were not just her confidant, but someone who had power over her, power that Megan never fully realized. This power dynamic had been building, and Megan, in her trusting nature, had unknowingly walked into the trap that was set for her. The confession revealed that the killer wasn't acting out of desperation or rage, they were acting out of a desire to show dominance, to assert control over Megan and everyone who thought they were beyond harm. It was an act meant to send a message that they could make anyone disappear. At this moment, the police realized that this wasn't just a murder, this was an exhibition of power, and the killer's desire to be in control ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. The confession came with a chilling admission: the killer had done this before, and they were planning to do it again. Megan's death had been the first, but it was only the beginning of a much larger, more terrifying agenda. As investigators pieced together the chilling details of the confession, they found themselves confronting a reality more sinister than they had ever anticipated. The killer had been watching Megan closely, learning her movements, her habits. They had been patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. When Megan had let her guard down, they made their move, taking her life without hesitation. The confession was methodical, almost detached, as if the killer were recounting a routine task. It became clear that the killer wasn't just someone who had known Megan. They were someone who had planned every detail of her demise. From the moment they entered her life to the final moment when her life was taken, everything was orchestrated with chilling precision. The revelation shook the entire community. Megan, who had once been so full of life, was now nothing more than a symbol of the killer's twisted ideology. But even more chilling was the killer's indifference, how they could so calmly recount the events of that night, as if they were discussing the weather. The chilling nature of the confession left investigators speechless, as they realized they were dealing with a mind unlike any they had encountered before. With the confession now in hand, the police had their answers. But the question still lingered. What drove this person to such lengths? What twisted need for control had led them to murder Megan in the most calculated way possible? And, perhaps most disturbing of all, how many others had they hurt, how many others had they manipulated, all in the name of power? As the story of Megan's death came to a close, we are left to reflect on the chilling reality of how trust can be so easily betrayed. This was not just a story of a woman's tragic death, but a warning. A reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the people we trust the most.
Megan's story may have come to a tragic end, but the question remains, what drove someone to kill her in such a cold, calculated manner? And more importantly, how do we prevent the darkness in our own lives from swallowing us whole? The story of Megan Newborough's death is one that will haunt everyone who learns about it. At its core, it's a tale of betrayal, manipulation, and violence, but it's also a story about trust, vulnerability, and the darkness that can exist within even the most familiar faces. How did someone she trusted with her life, someone who shared her circle, come to be the very person who would end it? What kind of mind would plan such a thing? What twisted need for control, for dominance, could fuel such an unimaginable act? These are questions that remain with us long after the case is closed. Megan's life was taken by someone who knew her intimately. The killer's confession didn't bring closure, if anything, it raised more questions than answers. Because Megan wasn't just a victim of a random act of violence, she was the target of something more insidious, a deliberate message, a warning. And the killer, chillingly indifferent, saw this act as a way to assert their dominance. To control her, to control the narrative of her life, and to send a warning to anyone who might dare to challenge them. As we reflect on Megan's life and death, we are forced to confront a much larger issue: what happens when trust is broken, when the people we hold dear are not who we think they are? What happens when we trust the wrong person? In a world where deception is often hidden behind a mask of familiarity, how can we ever truly know the intentions of those around us? Megan's tragic fate is a stark reminder that we can never be too careful. The world is filled with people who appear kind, compassionate, and trustworthy on the surface. But as this case has shown, sometimes that trust can be shattered in an instant. Megan's killer was someone who had been part of her life, someone she thought she could rely on, someone who knew her deepest thoughts and fears, and used that knowledge to destroy her. This case serves as a chilling reminder that danger can come from the most unexpected places. It's not always the stranger lurking in the shadows that we should fear, it's the people who we invite into our lives, the people who know us best, the people we let our guard down with. And Megan's death begs the question: how can we protect ourselves from the darkness that may lie within those closest to us? Though the case against Megan's killer has been solved, there are still more unanswered questions. As we try to understand the why behind this tragedy, we find ourselves confronted with even more unsettling queries. What happens when trust is betrayed to this extent? How do we protect ourselves from those who hide their true faces behind masks of friendship and affection? These are questions that no one can truly answer, but they are questions that must be asked if we are to prevent tragedies like Megan's from happening again. Megan's story is a stark reminder of the dangers that exist in the world around us. We live in a society where we often put our trust in the wrong people, only to have it ripped away when we least expect it. And though Megan's murderer is behind bars, the damage is done. Her life has been taken, and the scars of this tragedy will remain on the hearts of those who knew and loved her. Sometimes, the truth is far more unsettling than the lie. Megan's death was a grim illustration of how darkness can silently creep into our lives, undetected, until it's too late. But the real question is, how do we move forward from this? How do we ensure that we don't become the next victim of betrayal? What do we do when we realize that the people we trust most may not be who they appear to be? If you have any thoughts on this case, theories, or details we missed, leave a comment below. Your voice could help uncover even more truth behind this twisted crime. This story doesn't end with the arrest of the killer, it's an ongoing investigation into human nature itself, into how far betrayal can go, and what it means for the people left behind. We may never fully understand the motivations of the killer, but we can all learn from Megan's story. It's a story that reminds us to be vigilant, to question, and to be wary of the darkness that can exist even in the people we trust. If you have insights or thoughts about this case, don't keep them to yourself. Drop them in the comments below. Your thoughts, your voice, could help shine a light on more details that might bring us even closer to understanding the twisted mind behind Megan's tragic death. Megan Newborough's tragic murder may have been solved, but there are still more unanswered questions. And in the end, it's up to all of us to stay vigilant, to ask the hard questions, and to protect ourselves from the darkness that can sometimes hide just behind a smile. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime documentaries. Stay safe, stay aware, and keep asking the questions that need to be asked.